Welcome back to our new show, PS Weekly, on the Miseducation podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Duquesne. Every Monday, our student reporters bring you New York City schools coverage that you won't find anywhere else. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know that the Bell just launched a crowdfunding campaign to support our work. Our goal is to raise $10,000 by the end of the month, and we need to pick up the pace if we're going to reach it. Among other things, the funds will allow us to buy a more reliable set of audio equipment for our students. And trust me, we really need it. No contribution is too small or too big. To help us out, just go to bellvoices.org/donate. That's bellvoices.org/donate. Thank you. Last month, I accompanied one of our reporters, Jadelyn Camey, to a press conference at the DOE headquarters. Chancellor David Banks was announcing new changes to the middle and high school admissions process in New York City.
If a young person is working their tail off every single day, and they get a 99 average, and they're seeking to go into one of these screen schools, that ought to be honored.
And before you think, oh, I'm not going through that process, this doesn't apply to me, hold on. Who gets access to which schools is one of the oldest and most contentious debates in this country's history. Just think about how often this issue has landed in front of the Supreme Court. Just to name a few: Brown versus the Board of Education, Milliken versus Bradley, Fisher versus the University of Texas, and most recently, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. Questions of fairness in school admissions strike at the heart of who we are as a society and how that compares to who we say we are. It's a fact that the way New York City admits students to schools reproduces segregation along residential, academic, and racial lines. What was often seen as an only in the South dilemma is and has always been a Northern issue too. But Mayor Eric Adams and Chancellor David Banks have made it clear that integrating schools is not their priority. For what it's worth, no New York City mayor has ever made school integration a priority, which is why today New York City schools are among the most segregated in the country. Nowhere in the nation is the school admissions process as complex as it is here. I'll never forget at age 13 spending days researching schools in this humongous book with my immigrant parents peering over my shoulders, unfamiliar with this convoluted process. Here in New York City, we have specialized schools, zone schools, screen schools, unscreened schools, charter schools, hundreds of options in all. Sometimes I feel like you need a PhD just to make sense of how it works. Fortunately, Jadelyn sat down with someone who's as close to an expert as there is, a local education reporter who has covered these issues for years. To break down how admissions work here, what's changing under the new administration, and what's at stake, here's Jadelyn.
Okay, so Alex, can you please start by introducing yourself?
Yep. So my name is Alex Zimmerman, and I'm a reporter for Chalkbeat New York, where I cover New York City public schools.
All right, thank you. So before we go on to what's actually changing this year, can you explain in the simplest terms how the New York City admissions process works?
I'll try, although as you know, it can get pretty wonky pretty fast. But the basic idea is that for middle and high schools, students rank their top 12 choices in order of preference. Some of those schools are screened, meaning that they can take into account students' academic backgrounds in admitting students, but most other schools actually aren't screened. But regardless of the type of school you're applying to, every single student has to apply by ranking their top 12 choices. From there, a super complicated algorithm then matches students to schools. And in most cases, students are admitted to one of their top choices. A fun fact about the admissions process is that it was actually the algorithm that matches students in schools was actually created by a New York City public school graduate and actually won the Nobel Prize for designing that algorithm. And then, so aside from that, those main bucket of schools that you apply to by ranking your 12 top choices, there are then 8 specialized high schools that admit students on the basis of a single test, and that's sort of a separate admissions process.
Okay, so that process is like familiar to me because when I was like in eighth grade, or even like before, I had to apply for middle school, and I know it's like familiar to us in New York City, but I do understand that it's like kind of different from different places like around the country. So what's it that makes the New York City admissions process unique from other places?
Yeah, so in lots of other school districts, students are assigned to school based on where they live. So a high school might have like a specific catchment area or a zone, and just everyone who lives within those boundaries attends the same high school. There isn't really an application process. You're just sent to your local school. But in New York, especially at the high school level, students can theoretically apply to any high school in the city, and there are more than 400 of them. So students have a lot of choices when they apply to high school in New York City. And New York is also pretty unusual in that a fairly large slice of those schools are allowed to sort students based on their previous academic records. So it's not just based on where you live, you have all these schools to choose from. And then within that, there are a bunch of schools that can have admissions criteria that, you know, can range from grades to essays and interviews and all sorts of things. Some of that is changing, and I know we'll get to that later. But yeah, the basic idea is that in New York, you have this really unusual degree of both choice and also just sort of different admissions criteria at different schools.
I get that. I went to my zone school when I was like in middle school, but I did like try to apply to other ones, but I know my parents wouldn't have let me like go to them because they were a little bit more far from my house. And that is so mean of them because my brother, we live in like Astoria, and my brother goes to Hunters Point middle school, and he would have to, you know, take the train, and I wanted to go to that school before, and they wouldn't let me, so they just like, I had a school that was like 2 minutes from my house, so now I'm mad at them because of that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, we've definitely talked to students who, you know, a lot of students do go to schools that are near where they live, but it's also true that there are lots of students who are on the subway for an hour or two, like every day, just to get to the school that they chose. Yeah.
Yeah, so like we reported on some of these kind of like similar issues before, but like can you explain like the connection between like the current admission policies and like the segregation?
Yeah. So in lots of school systems, segregation is driven to a large degree by like racial segregation in housing. There were historically like lots of housing policies that entrenched neighborhood segregation by race and, you know, specifically excluded Black people from getting mortgages in certain neighborhoods. And I think those policies are sort of reflected in New York City too. Like that is certainly driving some of the segregation we're seeing in schools. But I think it's also the case that the criteria that lots of schools have been allowed to use to screen students, including measures like test scores or attendance, have also led to disproportionately few Black and Latino students at many screen schools. And I think it's also worth noting that those screening policies may also exclude other student groups, including those with disabilities or students who are living in temporary housing or students who are still learning English. So I think there are sort of some complicated dynamics in play with regard to like residential segregation and the role of screening, but I think those two things are definitely playing a role. And then I think another thing that's just worth noting is that the degree of choice that students are allowed to exercise in applying to New York City public high schools or even middle schools requires that families have like a lot of information about those schools and have time to like attend open houses or go on tours and really research all the different choices. I think families with less access to time and resources might have a harder time making sense of all of those options.
Yeah, and when talking about like specific admission requirements for like screen schools, what are some arguments that you hear for people? Because I know it's like a very controversial topic. So what are some arguments that you've heard for people in favor of screens?
Yeah, I think some of the most common arguments are that screens are a way to make sure that the strongest students get a really rigorous education. This next argument, they often will say that they want to make sure that middle-class families are sort of stay in the school system. I think you will often hear it sort of less specifically directed at sort of like, we want to make sure that white families are staying, but I think historically screening has kind of worked that way. I often hear the argument that attending a selective school can be a mechanism for social mobility for low-income students or immigrant students, and just other groups who are willing to kind of put in the work and get into a competitive school and then get into a competitive college, and that's sort of a pipeline. And the people who are in favor of screening, when they're asked about some of the segregation that we've been talking about, they will often argue that, like, one way of addressing that is that more work should be done to improve the quality of schools that serve lots of Black and Latino students, to give them better access to screened schools rather than sort of changing the admissions criteria.
Yeah, I know it's like definitely hard, and we're going to be discussing this later, but like some comments made by the chancellor about this too, and I get where like he comes from and I get his argument, but then I feel like it's also not that, like, you know, black and white. It's like a lot of factors that contribute to it. So what about the people that, you know, oppose to screenings? Like what are they saying about it?
Yeah, so I think people who oppose screens often argue that separating students based on their academic records can be damaging for lots of students. You end up with this academic segregation where you have schools where basically every student coming in is behind grade level. People who are skeptical of screening also argue that there's a body of research that suggests that classrooms with a more diverse mix of students, both in terms of like race and socioeconomics, but also in terms of their like academic records, can have strong benefits. And this might seem super obvious, but they also just argue that segregation is harmful and policies that entrench segregation are bad. And I think that, you know, we'll basically argue that rolling back screening will give more students access to a broader range of schools. And I think we'll also argue that, like, contrary to the idea that, like, we just need to fix, like, elementary and middle schools to make them more rigorous, that, like, I think people who are skeptical of screening will argue, like, there are already plenty of, like, academically talented Black and Latino students who aren't getting into these schools right now. And that the way that screening is constructed has led to that.
So in January, Eric Adams takes over as mayor, and he brings in a new school's chancellor, David Banks. And I just wanted to know, what's his philosophy on, like, these admission debates?
Yeah, so it's sort of interesting. Like, when David Banks becomes chancellor, he doesn't really come in with like a super strong set of policy commitments on this issue. You know, he didn't previously run a school system. He hadn't managed a large bureaucracy. So he hadn't really had to like formally weigh in on this before, or create policy around it before. And I think it's also just worth noting that the schools in New York that he helped launch, the Eagle Academy schools, are not screened, and they're geared towards serving young men of color. But I think pretty soon after becoming chancellor, Banks made it clear that he was at least sympathetic to the idea of screening, and sort of said, you know, was acknowledging that he was hearing from parents who were in favor of screening, and seemed to be sort of inclined that some degree of screening was important. And that was like a pretty big contrast to one of his predecessors, Richard Carranza, under the previous administration, who made it very clear early on that he was very skeptical of screening.
Yeah, I really hadn't gotten into, like, you know, like, reporting when Carranza was still on, but I do know that Mr. Carranza, I met him at a family party one time.
Like, he showed up to one of your, like, a family function of yours?
Yeah, I actually don't remember what we were celebrating, but he was playing, like, the guitar or something with, like, a mariachi band. I thought he was just singing and, like, you know, enjoying the party, and then people started going up to him, and I was like, who's that? And then it turns out that he was the chancellor, and I was like, dang it, I could have asked him if we could, like, have some more days off from school or something. I really blew it with that one, but yeah. Yeah, I also heard, like, you know, Chancellor Banks talking about, like, the screening, and last month I also went to, you know, his press conference, and Mr. Banks was talking about, you know, the big, like, changes that were going to be happening in the admissions process. Can you tell us a bit, like, what are these changes?
Yeah, so at the high school level, the big change is that students in the top 15% of their class or citywide will get priority to about 100 screen schools. An important piece of fine print there is that you also need at least a 90 average. So for this group of 100 screen schools, you have to meet those criteria to get sort of priority access. And if there are more qualified students than there are seats available, then there's a lottery. As we were talking about earlier, like historically different schools have had like very different criteria for admission. And so one benefit of this policy is that it gets rid of some of that like complicated variation between schools. And another important piece of this is that, they'll be considering students' grades, but they will no longer be considering students' standardized test scores like on state tests. One really important caveat, though, is there are about 20 other screen schools that will still be allowed to keep some of their specific criteria, including like essays or school-specific tests. So there are this 20 group of schools that will still be like a little bit of a Wild West in terms of what the criteria are. They also recently announced changes to middle school admissions. And in general, middle school screening was paused during the pandemic, but that will be allowed to return, but with a pretty big change, which is that before the pandemic, about 196 middle schools were allowed to screen at least some of their students. And now only 59 will be able to.
We've got more coming up from Alex Zimmerman in just a second. We wanted to take a moment to ask you, our faithful listeners, what do you think about all of this? Students, what was the admissions process like for you? Do you think it was fair? And parents, you too. Are you navigating this right now, or have you? We want to hear about your experience. You can DM us on Instagram or Twitter at MiseducationPod, or send us an email to podcast@bellevoices.org. We might even share some of your responses on a future episode. Now, back to the show.
So when he gave this announcement, what kind of like reactions did the public have?
Yeah, I think some advocates were happy to see that the process was getting streamlined, especially at the high school level, and felt like that could be a sort of win for equity because it means that families are more likely to understand the process because it'll be more standardized. And another piece of important information is that the city also committed to listing all of the open house information centrally to sort of make it easier for families. I think some parents and advocates were also happy to see that the standards were going to be tougher. Under the new, sort of top 15% system for high school, fewer students are going to qualify for that priority than the rules that existed during the pandemic. So the city is projecting that I think about 20% of students will qualify for that priority group, which is significantly fewer than did during the pandemic. I think there's also been a fair amount of concern over these policies among people who feel like the chancellor should have gone further in reducing the influence of screening. There are people who are concerned that this will make schools less diverse than they were sort of during the pandemic era rules, which really eased up on screening.
So since you mentioned like the standards of like getting into that top 15% or higher, so who do you think like benefits the most from these changes?
Yeah, so we know that during the pandemic, at the city's 27 highest performing screen schools, about 40% of the students who were accepted were Black and Latino, which is up from 28% in 2020 before the pandemic. But this coming year, we know that only about 20% of this year's eighth graders will end up in Tier 1, which is down from 60% during the sort of pandemic era rules. And in terms of that group of students within Tier 1, the city is projecting that about 10% of them will be Black, even though Black students make up 26% of all eighth graders. And those are according to like education department projections. And Latino students are expected to make up about 23% of students in Tier 1, even though those are 42% of all eighth graders. So I think the expectation in general is that the entering ninth grade classes at these high schools will be less diverse racially than they were last year, or, for those entering, but will likely be slightly more diverse than they were before the pandemic hit.
Yeah, and with all this, we're like mainly been focusing on like screen schools, but for example, my school, I go to Energy Tech, and it is not a screen school. So like for unscreened schools, have you heard from like any of the teachers or principals about like all of this competition for like screen programs? Like, what do they think about it?
Yeah, so my colleague a few years ago did a really great story on the impact of academic screening. So this idea that when you select students based on their academic profiles, you then end up with schools that are only serving students who are below grade level. And that story included this interview with a principal of the Gotham Professional Arts Academy. And that principal was saying, like, look, that year he had fewer than 5 incoming ninth graders who passed either their math or English state tests in the year before. And he was sort of making the case that, like, imagine a class where the students are talking about whether to keep the electoral college. Like, even having, like, a small group of students who, have more background knowledge or who are better prepared to engage in that conversation can, like, have a really beneficial effects for, like, all of the students in that classroom. And he was saying that sort of, like, those sorts of like peer-to-peer interactions are the sort of like secret ingredient in raising student achievement. So I definitely heard from principals and educators at unscreened schools who feel like it is just harder to achieve like good classroom discussion and sort of like a rich academic environment when like they're only admitting students who are behind.
Yeah, I definitely see the problem there. Even like I think a few students that are, on grade level or even ahead of it, I think that can really help other, the other students that aren't, up to grade level. So yeah, I think like screen schools, like taking all like the, good students, quote unquote, even though it's like, it gives it like a very limited view of like what students are considered good and what students are considered, bad. But I think it overall just affects like the possible like performance of the other kids on like unscreened schools. So yeah, I definitely see like the principal's point in that. So you reported on some comments that Chancellor Banks made a few days after like this huge like announcement about the big policy changes. Especially what stuck out in one of the articles to me was this quote, which he said that students who work really hard should have priority access, than the child who you have to throw water in their face to get them to go to school every day. So what kind of like, can you tell us the context of that and like what kind of like, what was like the backlash that he got?
Yeah, so he said that in the context of a speech that he was giving at the Association for Better New York, which is like sort of rite of passage for chancellors. It's like a group of business leaders and nonprofit leaders and like government people. And Banks was basically just giving a speech on his education priorities, like what is his agenda. And it also included like a little bit of a Q&A with a moderator. And so he was sort of asked about admissions and sort of said what you just read to me. And so I think that was widely seen as a pretty blunt and insensitive way of describing the admission system. And I did ask him afterward. He took some questions from reporters and I approached him and I asked him, like, what message he thought his comments might send to parents about like who the city's public schools are for. And he basically said like he didn't mean to like cast aspersions on any particular students, and that sort of anecdote came from a parent who sort of relayed that story to him. I do also want to point out though that like it just was the case that students who struggled to get to school were like not prioritized for admission to those schools. Like in some ways, like Banks is telling the truth when he says that, like as a matter of like who those schools are serving. But I think the idea that like some public schools, which are, you know, nominally supposed to be accessible to the public, are not for certain students who might have trouble getting to school, just like raises this big philosophical debate about like whether it's okay for a public school or a public school system to basically say to a group of students like, yeah, sorry, some of these schools just aren't for you.
Yeah, I when I was in his press conference, I did hear him like talk about like, students with like a higher like that work hard for their grades and like go to school every day, like they should, I think he said like it shouldn't be taken like, no, it should be honored. That's what he said. Like their hard work should be honored. And I was like, oh yeah, like I'm totally for that. But like then again, there's some other students that don't have like the opportunity to focus solely on like their academics and stuff.
One other thing I just wanted to note too, that sort of I thought was interesting was I was at the press conference where they announced the changes to middle school admissions, where they were, you know, pretty significantly reducing the number of middle schools that were allowed to screen students. And I asked him, I was like, look, you've been saying for the past couple weeks, like you've been making these full-throated defenses of screening. And now here you are telling us that like, actually, we're going to reduce the number of middle schools that screen. Like, what's up with that? And his response to me was basically like, it's not about what I think personally. Like, he was sort of saying like, look, I asked my superintendents across all of these districts to like make a decision that was best for their local community. And like, we listened to people. And so we're reducing screening in accordance with that. And it was sort of striking to me because it's like, you would think like if you were someone who had like really strongly held beliefs about the merits of screening and you ran the system, like you might want to put your thumb on the scale. But his sort of like public representation of what he did was like, no, like I wanted to let like other people sort of own this decision. And, you know, there might be some politics involved with that. Like maybe he doesn't want to be the face of whatever decision gets made on that. But like, it did sort of seem interesting to me and made me wonder, like, maybe like these admissions policies just aren't the thing he cares most about in his job right now.
So for like the admissions, the admissions process, I was a bit familiar to it when I was like in 8th grade. It was definitely like different because of like COVID afterwards, because I had to like change schools. But what's the timeline looking like this year, and like what sort of feedback are you getting from like students or parents?
So the deadline to apply to high school this year is December 1st. And I think offers are supposed to be released in March. And honestly, I haven't been hearing a ton about the process from students and families, but I do think it's an interesting question. And it's like an interesting reporting question to see sort of like, are there differences this year in how people are perceiving the process, or like whether they're finding it easier to navigate or not?
So, well, for right now, that was all the questions that I had. But is there anything else that you would just like to add on or share?
I think you can always learn a lot about like what a school system prioritizes by how it handles enrollment and admissions policies. And so I think it is sort of an important area to continue focusing on.
All right, thank you. Also, for the listeners who aren't already reading Chalkbeat, can you share your website and like your social media for them?
Yes. So our website is ny.chalkbeat.org, and our Twitter handle is just @chalkbeatny.
All right. Thank you again for agreeing to do this.
Anytime. Thanks for having me, and thanks for asking like really great questions.
We will be sure to follow this story as it plays out the rest of the year and share any major developments. For now, we want to thank you for tuning in to the second episode of PS Weekly. Woo! We are off and running. And don't forget, if you can, we would really appreciate your support on our current crowdfunding campaign. You can learn more and give at bellvoices.org/donate. This episode was produced by Taylor McGraw, reported by Jadelyn Camey, and hosted by me, Sabrina Duquesne. Music by Lenz Lewis and Blue Dot Sessions. Our work is made possible in part by the Summerfield Foundation, the Pinkerton Foundation, and FJC. Tune in next Monday for another episode of PS Weekly. We have a special treat for you guys. See you then.